It was one of those rare days when everything felt perfect. The sun was high above, casting flickering shadows through the trees. The warm breeze made you want to lose yourself in the woods for a while, and I had always cherished those escapes to the nearby forest. It was a tranquil place, a sanctuary where I could be by myself and think. On that day, I wandered deeper into the woods than usual, my footsteps softly crunching on the forest floor, the scent of pine filling the air. I was used to heading out without telling anyone, and I didn't expect anyone to follow. As I moved further, the sounds of the house, the daily routine I had left behind, faded away, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. I found a perfect spot, secluded and quiet, with a fallen log to sit on. The air was calm, and the only interruption to the silence was the soft hum of nature. I sat there, savoring the moment, unaware that my peaceful retreat was about to take an unexpected turn. I had been lost in my thoughts for what seemed like hours when I heard a sound. At first, it was faint, like something moving through the brush, but it grew louder. I froze, my heart racing as I wondered what it could be. While I wasn't afraid of the woods, it was unusual for anyone to be here at this time of day. It didn't take long before I realized the noise wasn't random. It was footsteps, and they were getting closer. Suddenly, from behind a group of trees, she appeared, my stepmother. I was completely taken by surprise. She never came into the woods, let alone followed me out here. I quickly stood up, my mind racing with questions. Why was she here? How did she find me? She didn't speak at first, but her eyes met mine, and for a moment it felt as if time had stopped. There was something in her gaze, something different. Her usual calm expression had slipped, replaced by one I couldn't quite place. Part curiosity, part intrigue. "Hey," she said at last, her voice softer than usual. "I didn't expect to find you here." I swallowed, unsure of how to answer. "I just needed some space," I replied, trying to sound casual, though I was far from calm inside. She took a few steps closer, her eyes never leaving mine. "You come out here often, don't you?" she asked. I nodded, still unsure of where this was going. Something about her behavior felt off. My stepmother had always been kind, but we were never close. Yet, standing there in the middle of the woods, it felt as if all the distance between us had vanished. It was just the two of us, alone, surrounded by trees. She sat down on the log I had just vacated and patted the spot next to her, inviting me to sit. Reluctantly, I did, though every nerve in my body was on edge. I couldn't help but notice how close we were now, closer than we had ever been. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence was thick with tension, but I couldn't figure out why. She was the one to break it. "You've grown so much," she said softly, her gaze fixed on my face. "It feels like just yesterday you were a kid running around the yard." I didn't know how to respond to that. It was true that I had changed over the years, but hearing her say it like that felt strange. "I guess time flies," I muttered, trying to sound casual. She smiled, but it wasn't the smile I was used to. There was something behind it, something more. Then, before I could even comprehend what was happening, she leaned in closer. Her hand brushed lightly against mine, sending a shock through me. "I've been thinking," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind rustling the trees. "About us." My heart began to race. I wasn't sure what she meant, but the way she was looking at me, sitting so close, it all felt wrong, yet there was something captivating about it. I knew I should get up, walk away, or say something to break the tension. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed, caught between confusion and a feeling I didn't want to admit. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaky. She hesitated, her eyes flickering with doubt. Then, in a move that completely took me by surprise, she reached up and gently touched my face, her fingers tracing my jawline. My breath caught in my throat as I felt the warmth of her hand against my skin. "I mean, we've never really been close, have we?" she said, her voice filled with a tinge of regret. "But I've always felt like there was something between us, something unspoken. I didn't know how to respond." My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what was happening. This was my stepmother, the woman who had married my father. Yet, the way she looked at me now, the way her touch lingered on my skin, it was as if she was seeing me in an entirely new way. Before I could say anything, she leaned in even closer, her lips only inches from mine. I could feel the heat of her body, her breath warm on my skin. My heart was pounding so loudly, I was sure she could hear it. Time seemed to stretch, each second dragging on forever. "I've been watching you," she murmured, her eyes locked onto mine. "You're not a kid anymore. You're a man." My mind was a whirl of emotions, a storm inside me. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was my stepmother, but here we were, alone in the woods, the lines between us blurring in ways I had never imagined. I opened my mouth to say something, to stop this before it went any further. But before I could speak, she closed the gap between us. Her lips pressed against mine in a soft, tentative kiss. It was brief, but it sent a jolt through my entire body. I pulled back, my mind screaming for me to stop, but my body betrayed me. "I shouldn't have done that," she said, pulling away, her voice filled with guilt. But even as she spoke, I could see the desire in her eyes. I got to my feet, needing some space between us. My head was spinning, and I didn't know how to process what had just happened. This wasn't right. It couldn't be. But the way she kissed me, the way she looked at me, it had stirred something inside that I couldn't ignore. "I need to go," I muttered, taking a step back. She stood up as well, her face torn between regret and something darker. "I'm sorry," she said, though part of me wasn't sure she truly meant it. Without saying another word, I turned and walked away, my heart still pounding, my mind swirling in confusion. I could feel her gaze on me as I disappeared into the trees, but I didn't turn back. As I made my way out of the woods, My thoughts were chaotic. What had just happened? How had everything escalated so quickly? What was I supposed to do now? When I reached the edge of the forest, I stopped and glanced back one last time. She wasn't in sight, but the memory of what had occurred lingered, haunting me. I knew things would never be the same. There was no going back now. I had crossed a line, and I had no idea what would come next. The only certainty was that this was the beginning of something far more complicated than I had ever imagined. As much as I wanted to forget what had happened in the woods, I knew I never would. My life had just taken an unexpected turn, and there was no telling where it would lead. As I stepped out of the woods, my mind raced, each thought tumbling over the next, like a storm. The calm I once felt among the trees had vanished, replaced by a whirlwind of confusion, guilt, and a strange thrill. I needed to make sense of what had just occurred, but the reality of it felt like a burden I couldn't escape. The memory of my stepmom's kiss replayed in my mind, confusing, both intoxicating and unsettling. I had always seen her as an authority figure, someone who was part of my life in a purely familial way. But now that image was shattered, and I was left grappling with a new, unsettling truth. When I got home, I avoided making eye contact with her. I was relieved when my dad walked into the room, giving me a reason to retreat to my room. I locked the door behind me, sat on my bed, and buried my face in my hands. How had things gone so wrong? I kept replaying the moments in the woods, trying to figure out what had driven her actions. Had she felt something more than a passing attraction, or was this just a momentary lapse in judgment? The following days were agonizing. Every time I saw her, I was reminded of what had transpired. The tension between us was palpable, an unspoken acknowledgement of what had happened that changed everything. My dad seemed unaware of the shift in atmosphere, but I couldn't ignore the weight now between my stepmom and me. It was clear something needed to be addressed. The silence was deafening, and I found myself avoiding her whenever I could. Each time we crossed paths, my heart raced, my mind flashing back to that moment in the woods. I couldn't keep living in denial, avoiding the issue. It wasn't fair to either of us. One evening, as I was heading to the kitchen, I found her waiting there. Her expression was serious, but not unfriendly, as if she had been waiting for me. I froze, my pulse quickening. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. I nodded, though my throat felt tight, and followed her into the living room. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, the room feeling small, the space between us heavy with tension. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," she began, her voice steady, but with an emotional undertone. "I know it was unexpected, and I'm sorry for the confusion it caused." I nodded, unable to meet her gaze. "Yeah, it was a lot to take in," I muttered. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," she continued. "It was a moment of weakness. I've been struggling with my own feelings and didn't handle it well." Her words made me look up. There was a vulnerability in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. She wasn't just apologizing. She was opening up about her own struggles. "I don't want things to be awkward between us," she said. "I value our family and want to maintain a respectful relationship." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I understand. I just need some time to figure things out. It's a lot to process." She nodded in agreement. Take all the time you need. I'll respect your space. We sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the situation settling between us. It was clear this conversation was just the beginning of a long process. We both needed to sort through our feelings and rebuild the boundaries that had been blurred. As the days passed, I tried to focus on my own well-being. I spent more time with friends and engaged in activities that helped distract me. The woods, once a sanctuary, now felt like a place filled with painful memories, so I avoided it for a while. Instead, I sought comfort in other parts of my life, finding solace in familiar routines and friendships. My stepmom and I kept a polite distance, exchanging courteous greetings, but keeping our conversations brief. The change in our dynamic was noticeable, and although it was awkward, there was an unspoken understanding between us. We both knew things couldn't return to what they had been before, but we were both committed to making the best of the situation. Over time, our interactions became more comfortable. The initial awkwardness faded, replaced by a careful respect for each other's space and feelings. It was clear the incident in the woods had left its mark, but we were learning how to navigate our new reality. Life went on, and while the woods remained a place filled with complicated memories, I tried to find peace in moving forward. I realized that, though the experience had been unsettling, it had also been a catalyst for personal growth. I learned about boundaries, personal space, and the importance of communication in relationships. The situation with my stepmom was still evolving, but the key was honesty and respect. As time went on, we found a way to coexist, understanding that while things had changed, we could still find common ground and maintain some sense of normalcy. And so, life moved forward. The woods, once a place of unexpected revelations, became a distant memory as I focused on the future. The experience had taught me valuable lessons about relationships and the complexity of human emotions. It was a chapter in my life that had left a lasting impression, and though I hadn't anticipated it, it had shaped me in ways I was only beginning to understand.